Today I'll be presenting our work on large language model-based surprisal metrics and their associations with cognitive and mental health correlates in the healthy adults. So most of what we know about language in general and surprisal in particular comes from comprehension, right? But we know much less about production and how our brains choose words that are both coherent within a context, but also surprising and informative enough to convey new information. So in this project, we're kind of taking a first step towards understanding the role of surprisal in production, and specifically, we're exploring whether individual differences in things like cognitive flexibility and mental health symptomology might tell us, might lead to more or less surprising language. So our broader goal is really to see whether these metrics can capture meaningful individual differences, essentially. So to start off, I want you to take a look at this picture, and I want you to imagine that you were asked to tell me a story about it with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you were given no time limit. How would you structure your story? So some people might start by introducing the characters, others might start by introducing the problems. You might even just jump straight into the action and say that two firefighters pulled up with a ladder to save the cat and the man off the tree. So there are so many different ways in which you can structure this story, and so many different choices about sequencing and so on that you have to make, and level of detail and whatnot. And all of these choices affect the surprisal and how informative your speech is and how predictable your language is. And this ties directly into information theory, which we've heard about quite a bit over the past couple of days, so I'm not going to go into the details, but essentially this theory posits that the more predictable a word is, the less information it carries. So the more surprising it is, the more information you have to process. And so as people tell this story, for example, the amount of surprisal in their speech reflects the flow of new information over time as they progress through the narrative. And that brings us to our key question. Can that flow of surprisal reveal anything meaningful about a person's cognitive abilities and or their mental health? So to explore this, we analyzed spontaneous narratives from a large lifespan sample of adults. Specifically, we used data from 181 healthy adults who participated in the Aging Brain Cohort Study, which is a laboratory at USC that aims to create a repository with neuroimaging, behavioral, cognitive, and mental health data from individuals between the ages of 20 and 80. So there's quite a bit of a range there. So as part of the standard protocol, each person completed the cat rescue task that we just looked at, and we analyzed the transcript using a transformer-based language model to calculate token-level surprisal, which I'll break down in a little bit more detail later, but we used Meta's Llama 2, which is trained on 13 billion parameters. But for now, the key point is that we extracted summary surprisal metrics, and we tried to look at how they are related and how they're associated with their cognitive function and their mental health. So for cognitive measured, we used the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which I'll be referring to as MoCA from now on. It's a widely used clinical screening tool for cognitive impairment. It's a brief 30-point test that covers domains like memory, attention, language, executive function, and so on. And then we looked at the total score, which is out of 30, and then also the language and memory sub-indices within that test. And then for mental health, we used the PROMIS depression and anxiety self-report scores. And that gave us a way to kind of explore how language use in this simple kind of open-ended, more or less task might be tied to these individual differences. And of course, using speech to study cognition isn't something new. It's something that is well established in both research and both clinical and aging research. So people have been analyzing discourse and looking at features like lexical diversity, syntactic complexity, and so on, and to try to understand how cognitive processes show up in everyday language. So to ground our work in that broader tradition and to clarify why we chose to focus specifically on cognitive function and the sub-indices of the MoCA, let's take a look at this review paper that was published recently by Richard and his colleagues that maps it out really nicely. So this figure comes from their paper, and you can see on the left a list of linguistic features that are most commonly extracted in studies of clinical groups, and more specifically notably the MCI, mild cognitive impairment group, which is especially relevant to our question. And on the right, you see the same features, but they're broken down by discourse genre. So these are really small, so I don't know if you can see them. But things like descriptive narratives, open-ended tasks, and spontaneous speech and semi-spontaneous tasks. And we can see that core features like speech rate, frequent word frequency, word choice, informativeness, and things like that are kind of show up as significant in a lot of these studies. And that kind of motivated, going back here, and that motivated our decision to examine the MoCA total as well as its sub-indices to kind of try to tease apart the role of each of these subcomponents. So while the method itself of using surprisal from large language models in production is kind of relatively new, the outcome measures are grounded in a well-established framework of linking speech to cognition. And then when it comes to mental health symptoms, the study by my former colleague Victoria Sharp offers a useful comparison point. So they used a storytelling task that is similar to ours and measured lexical predictability using GPT-2 and GPT-3. And their goal was to see whether individuals with schizophrenia who had higher levels of positive thought disorder symptoms produced less predictable language. And this graph shows that while lexical probability increased when more context was available, so on the x-axis, we see reduced discourse level coherence. We see that they do actually become more predictable, but not as much as the healthy population. So the decrease is statistically significant. So this suggests that people who had higher symptoms of positive thought disorder were less influenced by prior context, and they had reduced discourse level coherence. Even in a task like the one they did, which is just a storytelling task that would typically support strong contextual scaffolding. So that led us to ask, what about subclinical symptoms like anxiety and depression that are more common in the general population? So there's obviously reasons to think why they might matter, right? We know that depression is often linked to flatter, more less elaborative speech, whereas anxiety is linked to more erratic speech due to increased cognitive load, difficulty maintaining structure, and so on. So any of these things that are associated with anxiety might affect how surprising your speech is over time. And that led to our central question: could subtle differences in mental health or cognitive status in a non-clinical, healthy aging population be reflected in the structure of lexical probability across a short, spontaneous narrative? So in other words, if we zoom out from specific word choices and we look at how predictability unfolds across the story, do we start to see meaningful variations linked to cognition and anxiety and depression? And that's what we set out to test with a set of hypotheses, obviously grounded in prior work, but also tailored to our specific population. So on the cognitive side, we hypothesized that participants with stronger cognitive performance will have more predictable speech that kind of is more context sensitive and internally coherent. And vice versa. And then for mental health, we considered two separate pathways. So for depression, we expected speech to be flatter, less elaborative, kind of more constrained with fewer unexpected or novel elements. And this would result in lower overall surprisal. Whereas for anxiety, we predicted the opposite trend. So we expected people, due to cognitive load and difficulty planning speech, especially spontaneous speech, we predicted that they would have greater variability and surprisal over time. So while we're not directly measuring coherence or planning or anything like that, we're using patterns of predictability kind of as a proxy for understanding the underlying structure and organization of speech. So now I'll walk you through how we actually quantified these patterns. The first metric we looked at was mean, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's just the average level of surprisal, the overall average level of surprisal across their entire narrative. So a higher mean surprisal meant that someone used less predictable language and their speech was more surprising, and the opposite is true. And then the second metric we collected was variance. So obviously, the mean surprisal, it offers a very compact summary, right? It just gives you a very it gives you a window into how efficiently someone may be organizing their structure, but it doesn't really give you a lot of detail into as far as like how that unfolds across the story. And when it comes to variance, it reflects how much participants' lexical predictability fluctuates throughout their story. So does their speech maintain a consistent level of predictability, or does it fluctuate between very predictable? Are there like so many dips and peaks? And you can see that contrast clearly here in these figures. So on the left, you see a figure with high variance, and you see that there's a lot of spikes and dips, and that would suggest like more uneven or disjointed narrative, right? It might indicate that, you know, they're suddenly switching topics or they're not necessarily planning their narrative. And on the right, you see low variance, right? So there's a steadier, more consistent pattern across the story. So mean tells us how predictable a person's language is on average, and then variance helps us see how steady or erratic that predictability is from moment to moment. And then the third metric we analyzed was slope, which captures the trajectory of surprisal across the narrative. So it tells us whether their predictability tends to increase or decrease as they speak more, as the story progresses. So these three plots you see here on the left, we have a steep negative slope, and I intentionally did steep just because it is easier to visualize that way. With steep negative slope, you have the story length kind of on the x-axis and surprisal level on the y-axis. So the more the story progresses, the less surprising their language is. So that's what a negative slope is. And in the middle, we see a flat slope, where predictability kind of remains fairly consistent throughout. And then on the right, we see a steep positive slope where language becomes less predictable over time. So the more they speak, the more surprising their speech is, and the more difficult it is to follow and predict. And this metric kind of, we hoped, would help us get at how narrative structure evolves over time. And obviously, you would expect that slope to be negative, right? Because if anything, surprisal is also a function of what comes before. So you expect if a piece of speech is coherent, it should become less surprising as it progresses. So that's the reason we added slope, is to kind of see if we had people who showed the opposite pattern, who had a steep positive slope where their language becomes more surprising, and we try to see if there's anything that we might find there. So together, all of these metrics gave us a complementary perspective, how predictable that language is overall, how stable that predictability is, and how it changes as the narrative unfolds. So now that we've defined those, let's look at how we actually analyze the data. We ran a series of multiple linear regressions where we used surprisal metrics as predictors and tested their associations with specific outcomes of interest. So this example here is the model for the MoCA language index. And we wanted to isolate the relationship between language predictability and our outcomes of interest. So we added age at the day of testing and the total number of words they said in the story as covariates in the models. And that was done consistently throughout. So now let's look at results and how these surprisal patterns relate to cognitive function. Recall from our hypotheses that we expected participants with more steady, more stable and context-sensitive predictability to score higher on cognitive assessments, and that's exactly what we found. So on the left, you're looking at the relationship between mean surprisal on the x-axis and the total MoCA score on the y-axis. And you see that there's a significant negative association. Participants who used less predictable language on average had scored lower on the MoCA scores, on the MoCA test. And altogether, for this particular model, this model explained like 19.4% of the variance, which is just under a fifth of variance in MoCA total scores, which is quite solid for a spontaneous narrative task with minimal instructions and pretty much very minimal prompts. And as Dr. Philip Risnick mentioned earlier today in his talk, like in this kind of work, small effect sizes are the norm pretty much, even when the findings are statistically significant as they are in this case. So in our field, even a modest effect size can be meaningful. And then on the right, we see the results for the MoCA language index, which was our second significant finding, which focuses more specifically on, so on the MoCA test, this sub-index focuses specifically on fluency, naming, and repetition. And here too, we find that more surprising language is associated with lower scores. So the better you score on that language index, the less surprising your speech is and the more coherent it is. And this supports the idea that people who produce, again, language that follows context more closely also tend to perform better on these tasks. The effect here was also significant, but the overall variance explained was much smaller. It was about 3%. It's a promising indication that there is something there and that the average lexical predictability in spontaneous speech may be a useful signal of underlying cognitive function. Interestingly, we didn't find any significant effects for the MoCA memory index, which might suggest that these surprisal patterns are more tightly linked to language-related processes, although we recognize that it's really difficult to tease those apart. For mental health, we found that higher anxiety symptoms were associated with more negative surprisal slopes. So people who had higher anxiety tended to produce language that became increasingly more predictable as their story unfolded. And this model explained about 15% of the variance. One possible interpretation of this result is that it reflects anxious people's tendency to lean into safer, more constrained stereotyped structures over time, perhaps as a way to kind of reduce uncertainty and manage cognitive load during a demanding task like a spontaneous language task. And then for depression, although this raw scatter plot suggests a slight positive relationship, this effect did not hold up in the full model. So none of the surprisal metrics were significant predictors of a depression. At least in this sample, we didn't find anything strong evidence that the structure or dynamics of lexical predictability are associated with depressive symptoms. So to summarize, we found that surprisal metrics from spontaneous speech tasks can reflect individual differences in both cognitive performance and anxiety symptoms. We found that higher mean surprisal, lexical predictability, less predictable language, essentially, was linked to lower performance on cognitive tasks, suggesting that people with weaker cognitive and linguistic abilities may produce speech that is less semantically coherent and more erratic. Variance wasn't a reliable predictor in the sample, so we didn't find any strong evidence that moment-to-moment inconsistency and predictability maps onto any of the outcome measures that we were interested in. But we did find that slope and how predictability changes across the narrative was negatively associated with anxiety. That is, the more negative slopes were linked to higher anxiety, and as I said, that would potentially reflect a shift towards more rigid and constrained language as speech unfolds. And these findings together point to a broader implication that large language model-based surprisal offers a scalable, non-invasive way to quantify how people organize and produce language. And obviously, this is not a suggestion that these large language models or any of these tools can replace clinical assessments, but they may complement them in ways that are interesting, especially in contexts where time or resources are limited. So as language models continue to improve, there's real potential for applying these kinds of analyses in both psycholinguistic research, as we've been seeing, and also in clinical settings. And finally, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who contributed to this work. And I've had a chance to collaborate with an incredible group of researchers, some of whom are in the room with us today, like Dr. Amit, Almor, and Sarah Wilson. And I want to thank the ABC Lab and C-STAR and A-Lab for their interesting discussions. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, Sarah Branch at Vanderbilt. This was really super interesting. I wonder if you've thought about relating this type of finding to functional language use and interactive communication. And to give you some context why I'm asking about that, a couple of things. One, in our work with older adults and adults with brain injury, we found that some older adults who are the comparison participants don't score so great on the MoCA, and they don't seem to be aware of it. Mm-hmm. Likewise, sometimes we find that adults with brain injury perform much better than their partners expect them to. And so it seems to be some sort of asymmetries in self and other perceptions as in functional language use that I wonder if some of these surprisal metrics might help explain or understand why it is that there's some asymmetries in understanding how successful you're going to be at using language.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And it's actually something that was brought up in discussion with some of the speech-language pathologists at CSTAR, where they work with aphasic groups and people with mild cognitive decline and also progressive cognitive decline. It is certainly something that would be an interesting extension of this study, but as for the data that we're working with right now, this is just to kind of establish a baseline. But yeah, thank you.
Hi, very interesting. Sorry, Sarah Phillips, Georgetown. I think I had something related to Sarah's question. Oh, wow, Sarah, okay. Something related to Sarah's question and thinking about the MoCA and that you typically have a threshold that you would use as a way of suggesting whether or not someone has mild cognitive impairment. And that score usually is indicative of other comorbidities that they may be having, which can also lead to mental health issues. So, for example, I've now developed an MCI because I've had a stroke, and then because of that, I've also developed depression. So these kinds of things can very much correlate without necessarily being causative to one or the other. So I want to better understand your participant sample because you're calling them healthy adults. So how are they screened? Do you also look at other, you mentioned imaging. Are you able to make sure that they are all clear? Because a lot of them don't know that they maybe have had a small stroke or things like that. Just wanted some more clarity on that.
Yeah, thank you. There is, they do go through an MRI screening, and we do have their brain scans. And for this particular analysis, we actually excluded anyone who scored lower than 16 on the MoCA, anyone who we had any like abnormalities in their brain scans, like tumors and so on. When we say healthy adults, it typically means somebody who does not have neural injuries or things like aphasia and so on. So they're kind of more of the healthy population. I think Sarah actually can offer a little bit of insight on that if you don't mind, because she has worked there a little longer than I have. But yeah, there's definitely ways in which you can look at that and tease it apart a little bit more. Yeah, thank you.
I guess sorry, for a quick follow-up, I guess one of the concerns I have is other things like attentional neglect or maybe any perceptual issues if they have, let's say, a hemifield neglect, or if they have some kind of auditory processing issues like an attention deficit. So I don't know if that was also a part of your screener as well.
So yes, but we do also, our participant pool includes people who have ADHD and other attention deficits and so on. So they were not excluded.
Thank you.
Of course.
Hi, Thomas Clark, MIT. Thank you so much for the talk, super interesting. I guess I was wondering, my question is a bit about the interpretability of surprisal as this measure of coherence or semantic coherence, and I wonder if you could maybe give us why choose that interpretation of surprisal as opposed to sort of other ways of looking at what surprisal might index, it also correlates with, word frequency, and it also would index whether people are making more grammatical mistakes, which would cause higher surprisal. So I was wondering if you did some other, item level or fine-grained analyses about that, or maybe just some more, why that interpretation of surprisal versus some alternative explanations.
So the reason we chose surprisal as our core measure is because it allows us to kind of quantify how expected each word is given the preceding context. And obviously, as you said, there are many different ways in which you can look at that. And it gives us a continuous kind of interpretable measure that is sensitive to both coherence and informativeness. Obviously, with large language models, you don't know if it's looking at the lexical predictability or syntactic structures and how it quantifies that. But if someone is kind of producing very fluent but semantically off-topic speech, would expect surprisal to kind of fluctuate and so on. So do you have any specific suggestions as to what other factors might be included in the models to kind of make them a little bit
perhaps
stronger?
things like word frequency or coding for grammatical errors, or perhaps you could compare different types of language models with different types of context windows, like n-gram models versus large language models that look at more context. I guess that would maybe just reassure that this is about some sort of more long-term semantic coherence, as opposed to something that could be explained by people who are high on MoCA just make fewer grammatical errors or things like that.
That is a reasonable assumption, actually. And we are interested. We're actually, as part of this project, I'm just presenting a part of it, but we're also looking at specific context windows, and this kind of relates also to the working memory issue that was raised a couple of times here, where we look at 50 words of context. So each word is given, gets a predictability score given on only a 50-word context, and that kind of just slides across with it to kind of, and previous research has shown that that is actually kind of a long enough window where you kind of get some informativity, but also not too much to where it's so different from how a human mind would process language. So yeah, there's definitely too many different ways you can look at this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Francesco Vespignani, University of Padua. I was thinking about this change, of language model, if should push toward also a change in the statistical way we analyze data. So basically, you proposed the linear model, while we have like a GAMS, generalized additive model, or things like that, and Bayesian approaches. So to think that the whole sample of patients behave more or less in the same way is a strong idealization. So I think we should start thinking also, given we have so many data with the language model, even for a single subject, to try to model even single subject, maybe find out some specific subject that the clinical assessment says that it starts with the unorganized speech and then it converges or things like that, and see like similarity between single subject analysis. It's just a thought for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.